I'm on a walk, this time through some suburbia, and today I'm going to be talking about dynamic styles in Tailwind. So firstly, just super high level intro for the folks who haven't played with Tailwind. It's a library which does styling based on utility classes. So these are some predefined sort of syntax for using class names on elements to apply CSS styling. So for example, like P-1 will apply padding with spacing 1. And I've been using Tailwind increasingly kind of over this last year, and I'm building out my own application and I'm going all in on Tailwind. I'm really enjoying using it. It's definitely not without its drawbacks, but there are some really nice upshots to it. So something that's been really delightful in using it is that I'm using React, and when I'm writing my JSX and I'm writing the utility classes on the JSX, when I first saw Tailwind, I was like, oh, what is this? This looks really gross. But I've actually come to see how helpful it is, because a lot of CSS is about the relationships between elements, right? Like flex, grid, etc. Like you kind of need to know how elements are being positioned kind of relative to one another. And when you're defining the styles on the elements, I find it's really helpful to see more clearly what you're trying to achieve. I've been using a lot of other styling approaches. I'm a big fan of CSS and JS sort of abstractions where you're writing your CSS in sort of the same file as your component. And that's great, but usually they're at the top of the file, and the markup can be kind of close to the bottom. So there is kind of a bit of a disconnect. What I end up doing is kind of having sometimes two editors open side by side to see that mapping. But yeah, just having it all together actually is been quite nice. So today talking about dynamic styles. So what do I mean by dynamic styles? The first kind of category of these things are these sort of pre-built like selectors that exist on elements. So for example, hover, active, focus visible, right? So in Tailwind, you can just say hover : and then kind of whatever utility class name you want. And you can set up all of these styles that apply to the element at different times based on pseudo classes like hover. So after that, you've then got, okay, well, let's say I have a button component, and I sometimes want it to be a success button. Sometimes I want it to be an error button. Sometimes I want it to be a standard button. Sometimes I want it to be a primary button, and they'll have different background colors, potentially different text colors. How do I do that with Tailwind? It's a dynamic value based on a prop, a React component prop. How does this get applied to the element? And the simplest answer is with string concatenation. So you'll have your base styles in a string, and then you concatenate on additional Tailwind styles based on a prop that's passed in. So how I usually do is I'll set up an object with some keys. So you might have like success, error, warning, primary, etc. And then you'll have some specific styles, like for primary it might be BG blue 500, right? Well, that's one of the Tailwind's colors for background color. And so you kind of build up the concatenated class names or utility class names that will be applied using string concatenation. And this works reasonably well. You can use template literals for this. This works quite nicely. I've been using a nice API improvement on this, which is where I've created my own CSS function, which accepts strings or falsy values. And what that lets you do is you can then have your CSS function. So you got like class name equals CSS function. First argument can be your base styles. And then in all the subsequent arguments, you can pass in your conditional styles. And you can say, for example, like is active, ampersand, ampersand, then the string I want to apply when it's active. And if active is false, then that'll be false. And what happens in the CSS function is that it will, as it's looping over these arguments to create the final string, if it sees any falsy values, it just strips them out. Like if you're doing string concatenation, it's sort of a nicer way to do that. Now, string concatenation has a pretty big danger, and that is you can get clashing utility classes. So let's say I had, in my base styles, I had BG blue 100, and then later on I'm concatenating in BG blue 500. What do you expect to have happen? I mean, ideally, as a developer, I would expect that the last declared style passed in would win. However, that's not what happens when you do string concatenation. So what is happening is that, so firstly, when you look at an element, the style rule that will be applied is the one that has the most specificity. Now, these utility classes generally all have the same level of specificity. And so you would think, okay, well, maybe the last one wins. And unfortunately, that's not how browsers work. If you have multiple class names, or selectors that are being applied to an element and they have the same specificity, the order in which they're applied to the DOM element doesn't matter when it comes to specificity. What actually matters is that the last declared style selector in your style sheets will be the one that wins. You don't know if Tailwind's declared BG blue 100 or BG blue 500 first or second in the styling order, and I'm guessing sometimes that might be a bit non-deterministic. And so kind of what do, right? You want this last one to win, and you can get these kind of clashes. So what you might think you could do is go, okay, and this is something I did, is, all right, what I'm going to do is in that CSS function I mentioned before, I'm going to loop over all these utility classes, and I'm going to try and find a key for these values. So let's say BG, right? BG dash is the key. So I put them into a map in like a loop, just looping over all of the class, pulling out every single class name and looping over them and saying the key is anything before the first dash. And then you put those into a map. And so later ones will override, earlier ones. And then in the end, you take that map, convert it back to a string, split it. So you got the spaces between the class names and you're done. This worked really well. However, I quickly discovered that this is not a scalable solution for Tailwind. And that's because Tailwind doesn't have a consistent format for its keys. So I mentioned before, like BG dash, you can use as sort of the key you could think of for background color. However, there are other utility classes that it's not always what happens before the dash is the key. So a good example of this is pointer events. For pointer events, none, the Tailwind class is pointer dash events dash none. And for auto pointer events, it is pointer dash events dash auto. All those words are separated by dashes. So you can't necessarily say, everything before the first dash is the key. You can't necessarily say everything before the last dash is the key. You think of like BG blue 100 and BG blue 500, like BG blue is not the key, it was actually BG. And to add complication as well, you've got other utility classes that sort of touch similar properties. So let's say you have like P for padding. You can have P-1, P-2, and P-3. You could also have the PX for padding on the left and right. PX, dash 1, 2, 3. PY, 1, 2, 3. You then also got like PL for P left, PR for P right. You've got PS for padding start. You've got PE for padding end, right? So all these kind of properties can conflict with one another. And so you're kind of in this place where there's not really too much you can do simply to concatenate these together in a safe way. And this is where third-party solutions like Tailwind Merge come in. And what this will do is look over all these classes, it's sort of aware of what all these classes are, and we'll put say, okay, figure out, okay, this is to do with padding, it's touching this property, so only the last one, of this particular type is going to win, and it can be pretty intelligent about how it does that. Now, I haven't pulled that into my own personal project because it is a pretty heavy library. Can't remember the exact numbers. I think it was somewhere around 20 kilobytes minified, which I was like, I don't really want to pull something so heavy into my app. So what I've done instead is I'm just using that CSS function I mentioned earlier, which just does basic string concatenation. And I just have to at the moment, I'm just manually checking to make sure there's no clashing styles, which is often not too hard to do. So another practice I do is I try and keep my files with components relatively small. And so it's often pretty straightforward at a glance to see if you're getting any of these conflicts. Also, usually with these dynamic styles, usually I'm touching properties that commonly aren't in the base sort of styles. They're sort of all additional things, nothing that kind of overrides. Generally, I'm finding it's fine. It's not a huge problem. I'm aware of the foot guns. I mean, maybe I could explore or look into some additional tooling for some safety there, some authoring safety, but for now it hasn't been an issue, and it's, I'm saving close to 20 kilobytes, so I'm like, great, I'm happy with that sort of trade-off for now. Where you probably need something like Tailwind Merge is where your components accept arbitrary class names and you don't know what they are ahead of time. Tailwind Merge is kind of something you probably need to be doing in that case, because they could be passing in a style that conflicts with your styling. And you need to make sure that whatever's passed in is overrides. Now, again, I don't really have that use case because, I'm only building my own app. I'm not dealing with other people's code. And generally speaking, I actually think it's a bit of a smell when components accept class names. Class name is kind of this unbounded API. Right? You can pretty much pass in anything you want. And that makes migration at scale really difficult. And so what I try to encourage, in my own practices and in others, is that you're more explicit about what you accept. So for example, I mentioned like an appearance prop. So, this component only accepts like warning, danger, primary, that kind of stuff. And they're preset class names and you can apply them how you expect them to, and you're kind of not going to get any issues. If you open up class name, like they could pass in who knows what. And then also you get this strange contract where it's like, well, what element does this class name apply to? What if you had a few elements in your component? Does it apply to the root? What happens if you change how you do your styling? They may have been passing in some class names that worked. You change some internal stuff and it breaks. I don't like that idea that if you change the internals of a component, that you can break consumers. And so a class name prop can lead to that issue. So I try and not do it. That said, it is a pretty common practice and there are definitely use cases for it. And so I think if you need to reach for class name as public API, having something like Tailwind Merge is really important. I've had a little bit of a look in the Tailwind Merge library and man, it's awesome. It's a really complicated problem. And they've also got heaps of caching in there as well. So because if you're thinking about it has to kind of go over these class names and understand what they are and build up information about that, that's pretty expensive. You don't want to be doing that all the time. So they do have quite a lot of levels of caching in there, which seems fantastic. If you need it, it sounds like a great answer. Something I neglected to mention earlier, but is worth calling out in this conversation, is that with Tailwind, you can dynamically build up combinations of Tailwind utility class names with concatenation, but you cannot concatenate strings to dynamically create new class names. So you can't say like, I'll have BG dash, and then you pass in a string and you can create BG blue 500. That's not how it works. You have to have the style names predefined in your source somewhere, because how Tailwind works is it will look over all of your source files and just like look for any of these strings. And if it finds them, it will pull them out into their style sheet. So you can't sort of be dynamically creating these strings. All right, so I've talked about string concatenation and how that all works, but there is another option which is really interesting, and that is instead of for dynamic styles doing concatenation, you instead use data selectors on your element. So what does that mean? So let's say I had that case where I wanted a button that had like primary, warning, error. What you could do is instead add a, say, like data dash appearance prop attribute like to your element and set that to be the string. So it would be data dash appearance equals primary. Okay. And then in your Tailwind class, you can then write a specific utility class that targets that data selector. And Tailwind has a supported API for doing this. I can't remember the exact syntax off the top of my head, but it's something like data, dash square bracket appearance equals primary close bracket. colon, and then you write the styles. But what's really cool about that is then you're not doing any concatenation at all. You can actually just write all of those styles that apply in those different states all in the one block. And because it's all in one place, the Tailwind plugins that exist out there can be aware of these styles, see when there's clashes, and help give you warnings when you have any issues. And you sort of sidestep the whole issue of concatenation. So this is what ShadCN uses for some of its dynamic styling. So it doesn't have to be for props. It might be that your component's in a different state, like it's open right now or it's closed. You can write data selectors with utility classes without having to do any concatenation. You can just declare them all. And this is what ShadCN uses. For my own stuff, I don't know how I feel about the approach yet. I do like the simplicity of having it all declared in one place, and you sort of see it all there, but it really, really does even blow out the size of that class name string even more. I don't know how I feel about that syntax just yet. It sidesteps so many issues. It feels really fast. You don't need to do any concatenation. But on the other hand, it does kind of blow out that the size of that one string can be quite big. If you look at ShadCN, some of those class names can get pretty large. And I kind of like the authoring experience of having a CSS function and using, JavaScript values to conditionally apply styles. And because that concatenation is so cheap, it's like it does kind of feel nice to use. So I haven't leaned into the data selector syntax for dynamic styles yet, but I can see that being just a really, really nice answer to this problem in Tailwind. Now, the data selector thing still won't support you having a consumer passing in arbitrary class names, in which case you probably would need to reach for something like Tailwind merge. I've also been thinking about if I was on the Tailwind team, like what could be done to solve this? And maybe the answer is data selectors. That is the answer to this problem. And I think that's kind of fine. I also wonder if in the future potentially, so I mentioned that when you're doing concatenation, the big issue is having unique keys and making sure that if you had unique keys for styles that clash with each other, you can then do your concatenation stuff quite easily and make sure the last style wins. So I wonder if there's some future where, maybe Tailwind, instead of just printing to the DOM what people are authoring, maybe there's like another step where what is actually ends up in the DOM is a little bit different and has this sort of key format in it, so that then, you could have functions that know about this unique key format and could, do concatenation a lot easier for this dynamic styles. I did start thinking about that, but I kind of started to see issues with that approach. And it is really nice with Tailwind that what you author in the file is actually what ends up shipping to production. It's like, they're not minified. Those class names aren't minified. I've worked with minified class names in prod, and yeah, it can be a bit tricky to diagnose issues. Whereas when you have the Tailwind classes, like it's actually just really easy to see what's happening. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe the answer is just data selectors. Like that's it. That's the answer. Cool. Call it a day and go home. But yeah, I just wonder if there is potentially some other technical option there to enable safer concatenation. So we wouldn't need something like Tailwind merge. It's been great spending time with you today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.